All right, thanks for waiting. And thanks for coming out to Web Design Week 4. Hopefully you guys haven't had a good weekend. And if you are in midterm season, good luck. I know we're all struggling in this time. So yeah, and I'm just glad that everyone's here and not watching the debate because I don't know what I watched for the last 30 minutes. But yeah, no comment on that. Cool. Yeah, let's just get started. So this week we're going to be talking about CSS positioning and centering. Wow, sounds a little bit complicated. But before we get into that stuff, just a couple announcements. So this Thursday, just for this week, if you are in Bianca, Caitlin, or Susan's section, just go to someone else's lab section just for Thursday because they all have a midterm that day, and so they're unable to do a lab section. So again, if you're in Bianca, Caitlin, or Susan's cohort, join someone else's lab on Thursday. As for grading, we got a lot of questions. Like sometimes you probably see like, oh, like my homework 1 is not graded, but then my homework 3 is. So how our portal does is like it randomly assigns your assignments to everyone on staff. So it's not the same person grading all your assignments. So which is why like it's possible that one assignment that you submitted first can be graded later on. And so just be patient with us. We're all students and we have like busy schedules too. So sometimes we just can't get to them immediately. So as long as you can see your submission on your portal account, you're good. It doesn't mean that you didn't submit. So just be patient with us. And also, midterm project is released and you can find the spec on your portal today. It's worth 28 points and will be due in like a little less than a month. So this project is basically you're designing a whole website from scratch. Like we're not giving you any files, you're gonna do everything yourself now. And it might sound daunting, but it's actually really fun because the topic is to redesign Kingpin Donuts, which is, if you don't know, it's a donut shop in Asian Ghetto on south side of Berkeley. Their website is very, how do you put it, like, it's not that great. So that's why we're asking you to do a redesign, and you need to do at least like 2 views, like the home screen and the menus view. And then all the content is based off of your preference. So it's kind of like a free design thing. So there are some due dates you need to know of. The first of which, there's the first section, which is a project check-in, which is worth 4 points out of the 28. That is due next Thursday on October 8th before class. So the first part of this project will be you using Figma to design your views in high fidelity on that tool. And then to get things checked off, you can go to any person's office hours and show them your design, get some feedback, and then you can get the points. But keep in mind, it does have to be high fidelity, like basically fleshed out. And so that check-in is due by next Thursday. And we highly recommend you to just like do it earlier if possible, because there's a lot of you guys in this class and not many of us on staff. So every semester near like Wednesday, Thursday, the deadline, like office hours get super packed and we honestly sometimes might not even get to you. So don't take that risk. Try to finish early. We understand that you all have busy schedules too since it's midterm season, but please try your best. And yeah, so again, that's due Thursday or next Thursday. And the overall project is due Tuesday, October 20th at midnight. And again, for that, just try not to do things pretty last minute because things do pile up. Yeah. So after submission that week on Thursday for lab, we won't be doing a regular lab section. We'll be selecting like the top few projects that like look really nice so that you guys can present in this lecture, this same Zoom call in front of everyone, and you can show off your projects. So yeah. And as for submissions on this project, it will be submitted through portal and this Google form, which is this link here in submission. So you need 2. So like if you only submit portal, we might miss your submission because we're going to be using a Google form to track them. So yeah. And then again, thanks for you guys' feedback that you've gotten so far. Some person asked how my hair retains this volume or what hair products I use. Some good old water does the trick. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Cool. So a couple CSS reminders before we get into our topic. Remember that for a lot of the CSS selected or properties, you need units of measurements. So like font size or width, we need to specify like pixels, percents, point, M, VH, VW, like whatever metrics there are, because it needs to understand like how big it's going to be. Like if I just told you, if I asked you like how far away is like Dwinell from here, and you told me like 5, like I don't know what 5 means, like 5 miles, 5 hours, like, so there has to be a unit of measurement for a lot of these properties. There are some though, like opacity, that you might have known, like opacity can take in a value from 0 to 1 without any metrics at all. So there are some that are exceptions. So, and then also reminder, you need a semicolon after every single property value pair for CSS, or else it's gonna break. And then hover effects, a lot of you guys actually put spaces between your selector name and the colon, whatever pseudo selector. Don't put spaces or else it's gonna break. It's not gonna recognize anything. So A, colon, hover, no space. Don't put a space at all. And another CSS reminder, we notice a lot of this in your code, which is honestly not wrong, but like it's kind of a pain if you like write it out. Like let's say we have this HTML code here all nested in between each other. So a lot of you guys would type out like .big, .container, .a just to get to A. But if A is like the only name, or it's only used once, you honestly can just do .a, and that would be the same thing as this. The only reason we use like the spacing, like for like specifying where it is in case like we have another A class somewhere else outside of like this container big, then we need to specify like which one we're trying to change, if we're not trying to change both. So again, if like A is duplicate, then we might want to specify in the container, the A in the container, then we do this. Or if that's the only A in your whole file, just do .a. This is the same thing. So it saves you some time and saves us some time of understanding what that means. So yeah. And some brief review of what Nick went over last week of the box model, just like about like our HTML skeleton and how everything's are in like boxes and things. So, and the flow of how we position things. So it's important to think of all of these divs as containers in parent-child hierarchies. And for refresher on parent-child hierarchies, let's take this this picture on the right here. So div, this overall big div is technically a child of body because it's inside body. And similarly, A is a child of li, which is a child of ul, which is a child of nav, and so on and so forth. And you can keep going up the hierarchy like that. So that's what we mean by containers in parent-child hierarchies. You can imagine in HTML is like indenting this code because they're nested inside. So we really stress the importance of this because it's going to be kind of helpful during this topic today. And also when we have content to put in somewhere, we will position them relative to our containers, which like, for example, this picture on the right for our restaurants, like paragraph and the header, this is that content will be placed relative to how this container is placed. It's on the bottom left. So that's why all our stuff is in the bottom left of the screen. We're not going to put it like, even though the container's here, we're not going to put it on the top right. That wouldn't make sense. And then Asia went into typography last week, and one of the points was to help you think of type as blocks and spaces. So like paragraphs and headers, they take a certain amount of space as a block on the screen. So overall, the big deal about all these divs, boxes, containers that I mentioned is positioning. Like so far, you guys like haven't really touched positioning. Like last week, Nick went over like inline, how to put things next to each other instead of on top of each other. But you haven't really learned how like, I want to put it on this specific part of the screen. Like, how do I do that? So this is what I'm going to teach you today. And so when we position things, we are technically disrupting the page's normal flow of elements. And what I mean by normal flow is that like that's the default of what you see. You put one HTML tag on top of another, it'll show up on top of another or underneath another, because they take up the whole width, but it's like a column format. That's the normal flow of elements. So for positioning, there are a couple of rules that you can use. There are 4 in total. I mean, technically 3 you're gonna learn, because none, the first one, the default, is what I just explained and what you guys have already played with. But there's relative, absolute, and fixed, and I'll go into the details when I get to each of them in the next couple of slides. So for default positioning, oh, first of all, like for these kinds of slides, whenever you come to it and when you see like the window, this thing is blocking it, but it says window down here. But so like imagine this whole, this entire slide is like your browser window, and then like container is just inside this browser as a parent container, and then within the container itself we have A, B, and C, like rectangles of different colors. So again, window, imagine our window, our whole slide is our complete browser window. So in case of default positioning, we don't need to do anything because that's what you guys already know. Things flow in a column format. They take up the whole row, although in this situation they're not taking up the whole row, but they flow as in a column format. So there's nothing new here. So there's position relative, which now we can do some special positioning to it. And what relative means is that we're placing this element according to the normal flow, like it still flows in a column way, but then it's offset relative to itself. And this offset does not affect anything around it. So let's just go through an example of what that means. So let's say for B, I want to do position relative, and I say top 20 pixels, left 30 pixels. And you'll notice B is now in a different place than what it originally was. And it flows, it's offset to itself. So what top and left did was at the top above B, place 20 pixels, and then on the left of B, place 30 pixels. And that's based on this like axis, this XY axis that's how this offset works. And it looks like the opposite, like a mirrored version of like the normal math XY axis, but this is like the web version. But so that's what positioning does. And you notice how A and C both stayed where they originally were. So relative does not affect anything else but the thing we're changing right now, which is B. So another example, this time we say relative for B, but we're doing left 50 pixels and bottom 20 pixels. And so based on the same offset, like the origin axis thing, we're putting 50 pixels to the left, 20 pixels to the bottom of B. And that's why B is kind of covering A, but A and C are, again, still staying in the same places as they originally were. So that's relative. Now you can just place it, you already know one of these things where you can place it to a certain area based off of an offset. But then there's also position absolute, which is, in my opinion, kind of a little opposite of relative. So in this case, the element is pulled out of the normal flow. So it doesn't follow the column format anymore. And it's positioned relative to its closest relatively positioned ancestor. That may sound confusing right now, but I'll explain it in a bit. So for example of absolute, same thing, we're changing B, but this time we're saying position absolute, and I want to move it to the top right corner. And we say right 0 pixels, top 0 pixels, and wow, like B is now in the top right corner of our browser. Like it even went outside of our parent container. That's crazy. Like that's really weird. What if I just wanted B in just the top right corner of the container though? Like why did it go outside of my container? So what happened? Like, so why did B look kind of like break and go outside of our container? And that's because our parent container, this div called container, isn't positioned. We never gave it a position at all. So therefore, like, it's technically not on the web page, if that makes any sense, which is why B is like, oh, like, I'm just gonna place it based off of the very parent, like the one that is positioned, which is like body in our case. So that's what I meant by like the couple slides ago. It says closest relatively positioned ancestors. So this is where we need a combination of things of relative and absolute. So back to this slide, when I explained when we have content, we place them relative to their containers with this restaurant container example. And relative, the CSS property or the value is going to be important. So again, like I said, what if I wanted B to just be in the top right corner of our container, not the whole window, because that'd be weird. So first we need to position our container, relatively position our container. Now it has a position on our website when we say position relative for our parent container. Then when I do B absolute right, 0, top 0, then it would know like, oh, like my parent container is now positioned. So I'm just gonna do absolute and right top 0 based off of my parent container. So now it turns into like, oh, I'm in the top right corner of just this parent, not the whole window. So overall, like again, the parent, like relatively position your parent first before using absolute within it. And there's also important note, like when I said that absolute takes the element out of the normal flow of elements. So you notice how A and C are now, C is directly underneath A now. It took the place of B because B was pulled out of the flow of elements. So it doesn't have any space to take up technically. So that's why C moved up and now it's under A. So that's what it means to be pulled out of the normal flow of things. And if you guys have any questions throughout, just again, you have the chat or the queue on the portal, and then also unmute yourself whenever, that's fine. So what if we wanted to put things on top of each other with absolute positioning? That's a little bit easier. So let's see, we still have to position our parent with relative. So now everything will be positioned within this box here. And then let's say A, B, C all have absolute. So now we see A is here, A is here, and then B goes right underneath, and then C follows underneath. So they're technically on top of each other, but only A is showing because it's the highest in the layers. And again, this is based off of the offset. Relative is based off the offset of what we said, which we didn't have an offset. So that's based off of where it's at currently. So you could think of relatively positioned ancestors as the origin point for absolute positioning. So that's how you can refer, again, like with this slide, this is the origin point for absolute positioning. That's what relative positioning will use as offset for. So let's take an example of like the homepage of Airbnb. I'm not sure if they updated this, but this was a while ago. So basically this is what their homepage looks like if you want to book like a thing. Although I don't know why you do, it's debatable, but yeah, so like, let's just say like try to figure out where we use relative or absolute positioning. So does anyone want to give a shot of like, let's start with relative positioning. Like what is relatively positioned? Does anyone want to answer? Okay, no one. I guess I'll just tell you relative. It's just our whole window. Like that's the whole thing, because like if you can imagine, our whole parent needs to be positioned first or relatively positioned first. So we say like, you can imagine like body in your body selector for CSS, you do position relative. So now like everything will be positioned well inside of body in case you use absolute positioning. So now, does anyone want to point out like what uses absolute positioning in here? Scott says the box with text. Yeah, so I'm assuming you're talking about this like book thing on the left, right? So, and you're exactly correct. So absolute positioning does use, the box uses absolute positioning just so that we could stick it to the left side of our screen, our window. And that's how it retains its spot, because again, our parent is relatively positioned. And now when we use absolute positioning, it will be used like it'll be correctly positioned within there. And then you can further like explain it even more, like this inside, this is maybe this is relatively positioned, the box itself, and then inside here is also absolute positioned, so on and so forth. So that's just an example of how like you can use it in real life situations. And lastly, there is another value called fixed. So like absolute, this is pulled out of the normal flow. So again, like it won't have any space to take up technically on the window, but it's positioned relative to our window or viewport. And what I mean by that is, let's say like we have our regular window with A, B, and C, but now we have this like this whole blue bar on top. And let's just say that's our nav bar, our menu bar, where it has like home, about, project, I don't know, whatever you want in this nav bar. And imagine that this screen is now scrollable, which is why we have this makeshift scroll bar here. So when we say nav position fixed and we put it at the top, what fixed will do is that it will stay on that window or viewport no matter where we scroll. So we scroll down, boom, our nav bar still stays there because it's fixed and it's pulled out of the normal flow. So again, it doesn't take any space anywhere. So if you like have played with a lot of websites that have like these features, like their nav bar or their menu bar will stay at the top of your screens. This is the way they're doing it with CSS position fixed. So an example is our web design decal website. You'll notice like this red bar at the top where it says like applications are closed now because we're in the semester. If you scroll down, it will stay at the top of your screen because it's fixed to your window or viewport. So that's what fixed does. And there's also centering things, like what if you want it to be exactly centered vertically, horizontally, or both? So how we do that is like, let's just take like, we have a couple of containers, all like potatoes or whatever, and we want to horizontally center block elements. So how do we do that? We want to specify, use margins, surprisingly. So if we say margin right auto and margin left auto, this will say that like on the left and right, just pat it enough so that's equally centered horizontally. So that's how you center your containers horizontally. Or if you're a simple person like me and you don't want to write that much, there's also a one-liner where you can do, which is just margin 0 auto, and it'll do the same thing. So you don't have to write 2 lines of margin left, margin right, auto. You can just do it simply in 1 line. So that's what's easy about this. And then what if we want to vertically center block elements? So this would require a little bit more work. So we have to use absolute positioning in here. So let's say we have a big potato with this dimension. It's like 50 by 100 pixels. And we want to vertically center it. So how do we do that? We have to use, again, specify absolute positioning. And then from the top, we do 50%. So add 50% of like whatever unit to the top of our big potato. But you notice here, like when we do top 50%, it's not technically vertically centered. It's a little bit more than that because we did add 50%, but we went over. So now we kind of have to bring it back. So how we do that is through transform, translate y negative 50%. So what is the 50% doing in this transform? So since we're using translate y, that would just be the y-axis. What 50% means in the first place here is take 50% of the height of big potato. So because we're working with y, it'll look at the height. So 50% of the height of big potato, and we say negative, so move it up 50% of the height of big potato, which is why it comes back up perfectly centered vertically. So you do need this combination of top 50 and transform, translate y back up negative 50. Yeah. So we can also center things too, if you want to do both vertically and horizontally. And how you do that with, again, position absolute, but this time we need to specify like left 50%, and then in the transform translate property, we have to specify both x and y, so negative 50, negative 50%. And that gives you a perfectly centered block element. Yeah, so that's all about centering. And there is one miscellaneous topic that we want you to learn, which is called Z index. This is the first time I'm teaching this in this class because a lot of people are asking about this in previous semesters. So we'll go back to our example of position relative. You notice how B is on top of A kind of, but what if we wanted A to be on top of B? So we're kind of playing around with the layers of like the hierarchy of things on your web page now. So with Z index, we can specify Z index 1 for A and Z index 0 for B. And I mean, like Z index 0 is default for all things, even if you don't specify Z index, but I just put it here just for example. So now since A has a higher Z index than B, it will be on top of B now. And Z index, the range goes from anywhere from like negative infinity to infinity. So you could do like negative numbers, you can do positive numbers. I could literally say like Z index 1 million, and then like here's Z index 999,999. And it still look the same as 1 and 0. And you notice that Z index also doesn't take a unit of measurement. So you don't need to specify like pixels or point, whatever here, because this is just a hierarchy of layers. So whichever Z index is bigger, that will be on top. So that's a cool thing to know in case you run into an issue of like, oh, like why is my text underneath this like circle that's supposed to be in my background? That's weird. So that's a good point to know. So that's basically all for programming. That was a lot. Are there any questions about this stuff? I know this definitely confused me when I learned it. So if you have any questions, you can raise
Can
them.
you explain more about translate Y? Because I'm kind of like confused about that.
Yeah, let me go to that slide. So this translate Y, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so before we get to the translate Y, like I said, when we say just top 50%, it went over a little over, so it's not technically vertically centered. So like I said, we gotta bring it back up a little bit. So which is why we use translate Y in this situation, because translate Y refers to our vertical axis, and if you can imagine, translate X would be the other way. So, and then the 50%, what that means is like take 50% of the height of our big potato, which is like this much above the line, and then move it up negative amount, because that's what negative means, go up. If you said like positive 50, that would go down even further, which wouldn't look great. So translate Y again would correspond to the height of this box. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
I had a question about the center part. So when we're just doing horizontal, you use margin, and then when we did vertical, you use absolute. But how come when we combine it, like you only use the absolute positioning?
That's a good question, actually. I think honestly you can, because when you position vertically, we kind of have to use absolute because we're pulling it out of the normal flow. But like with horizontal centering, it's still in the same normal flow, right? Everything's like on top of each other in a column format, which is why we could use margin. But when we come to use a combination of vertical and horizontal centering, we have to use absolute for vertical already. So that means we have to do the same thing for horizontal, because if we just say margin again, like it was already pulled out of the normal flow of elements when we said absolute for vertical. So with margin, there's really no space that it took up, so it doesn't know what to refer to as margin. Like, where am I basing off my margins for? So that's why we say it just like left 50%, and then on the x-axis, negative 50%, move or translate that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
What's the difference between like translate and translate Y? Is there like a order and translate for like which corresponds to X or Y?
Yeah. So translate X or translate Y, they only take one thing, and that refers to X or Y, depending on what you use. But for translate, it'll take both the X and Y axis. So you can do, so the first one would be X, and the next one would be Y. So that's the order of how translate works. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Other questions?
I have a question about the horizontally center block element slide. I was wondering, when in like the second part where it was just one line that just says margin 0 auto, what's the difference between like adding that 0 there? Because doesn't that check? Because can't you just put auto?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So 0 in this case, because we have 2, like you probably normally saw like 4 things because for all 4 sides. But in the case of 2 arguments for margin, the first one would mean both top and bottom, and the next one will be both left and right. So you can simplify it with just 2 things, or with 1, it would just apply for all 4 sides. So in our case, our top and bottom are 0 because like in this case, we never really specified what top and bottom were because we didn't care. We only cared about horizontally centering our elements. So that's why our left and right were auto, which is why we say auto for the second part. This applies auto to both left and right. And 0 is just basically like, just, we don't care about both top and bottom. If you do want to like equally space these apart, like with like, imagine like this space here, you can specify like a certain amount. It will still be vertically or horizontally centered. It's just there will now be space in between. So I guess this visual isn't really a good representation since there is spacing in between. So you could probably like say like 1 or 2 pixels here because there is spacing above and below. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. Keep those questions coming if you have any. All right. Well, we have plenty of time to spare, so we'll give you guys like a couple minutes break, just for a breather, stretch, watch the debate if you want to. But yeah, Asia will be back to give you the design lecture.
Had a nice relaxing break. So yeah, let's get started with this week's topic, which is color theory. If you look at on the right, there is a painting that I made quite a long time ago based on Nantucket Dream by a real artist. And you can see in this picture that there are more ways of creating light than just black and white. And there are actually no real uses of pure black or white in this image. Like this is actually just very light blue, and this is very dark blue, and the juxtaposition of certain colors next to each other allows for that illusion of actual white and pure black, and we'll cover that a bit more in the lecture to come. So I'm sure you've seen this before around, either in art class or etc. Hang on, there's something in the chat on me. Oh, I see. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm sure you guys have heard of the color wheel. Basically, it's kind of a guide to how colors work in terms of light and in painting and in art. And I don't think it's super useful, but it's good introduction to understanding color. So red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. Orange, green, and violet are the secondary colors. And these are some like in-between colors. Between those, which are ternary, I think. And if you mix them all together, you make brown, or in light, you would get white, light. You might also get gray, depending on what type of paint you're using. But that's not super critical for you to know either. What you should know is that complementary colors are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So like red and green, blue and orange. These pairings often look good together, but it's not a hard and fast rule. They're just kind of a good place to start with understanding how they might go together. Also, colors that are next to each other is a thing too, I believe. So yeah, as I have been saying, design isn't the same as art, and you don't need to worry about knowing tons of art, knowing how to do art, or anything like that. You'll just get a feel for understanding how to use color more after this lecture and with practice. So here are some important vocabulary words and things to understand in using color: hue, value, and saturation. So hue is what a color is. So like the exact hex code in these color pickers. It's like any one point in this massive variety of colors, even just within this section, it is a hue. Then value is how bright a color is. So how much white or black is in it, how light or dark it is. Saturation is how much of the color and how intense it is. It's like actually in this hue. So left to right, more towards the right, it's going to have more saturation, higher color. More towards the left, this, if you pull the dot all the way to the side in Figma or in other design software, anything along this line is in grayscale. And that is without any saturation, so without any color. And here's some really nice illustrations, I guess, of how the different colors work. So you can see on the left there's a good example of saturation. So the middle is kind of like medium saturation, but then to the right, there's higher saturation. You can see that the color is brighter and almost darker to the eye. And then on the left, it almost looks lighter, but it's also less saturated. Then in the right image with shade and tint. Tint is like, if you go back here, there's this rainbow part, that's the tint. And then shade is how much white and black as well. It's kind of a different term for value. So just remember these circle blobs and it'll help you out with those things. So yeah, how do you pick what colors you want to use? So there are tons of sites that provide this for you, color schemes, individual colors. So this is colors.moozly. They just have color palettes that you can look through and ways that they're used. In an example to inspire you, Dribble. You can do this with as well. There's also colors.co. I know a lot of people have used this in previous years, and it generates color schemes. And if you like one of the colors that's here, you can lock it and then it'll choose ones that complement it, things like that. And it's super helpful for figuring out what kinds of things, or like what kinds of colors you want. And even if you think you know what colors you want to use, it's good to explore other options using these sites. There's also gradients.io if your site you want to have a gradient, but also it can help you create a range of colors that you might want to use. So maybe the midtones between these things, you have an idea that you want to use, like a red and an orange, but maybe you end up going with something in between. So yeah, multi-purpose. So now let's kind of get into the basics of psychology of color. And these are also not hard and fast either. Color is pretty dynamic and can be used for expression, personality, and branding, as we've talked about in the previous lectures. So red is in general a very emotionally intense color. So like hunger, dating, so love, and other just strong emotions, and it connects with your intense urges, and just passion in general. It's also often used in strong and bold designs, and also to denote important actions. So like if you're disabling something, unsubscribing, canceling, deleting, you know, all those things that can't be undone, things like that. And here's an example of it being used artistically almost in a website. It's a very strong statement in general. So blue is very common in a lot of general purpose websites because it's calming, it's easier on the eyes, it builds trust and rapport with your users. So like PayPal, Blueprint, which is a thing at Cal, Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, all of the things. In general, it's just a kind of calmer, neutral vibe at this point because we've become so accustomed to using it. Then, on the other hand, yellow is the bright and creative color. So it's associated with trendiness and quick decision-making. So companies that are trying to seem hip with the kids, like BuzzFeed, might use yellow. Amazon likes to use yellow so that you won't think about how many purchases you're making or how many things you're adding to cart. You might notice that other websites, even if yellow isn't normally part of their color scheme, that they'll start using yellow when you're around ordering things. And that's so that you think less about adding things to cart. And it seems like less of an important decision if you compare that to having that button in red. Contrast, it's a super important thing. The GIF on this side has such blinding colors. You don't want to do that. But basically contrast is a measure of the difference in perceived luminous or brightness between two colors. So even with a really good way to see or like to make sure that two colors you're using have contrast is to make sure that the value of them is very different, even if they're different colors. So blue and a yellow, even if the blue already seems darker, if you turned it all in black and white, they're going to be the same if they have the same relative value. And that's really important for readability and accessibility, as we'll get into in a second. So, as I was saying, with comparing the relative values, if you completely desaturate the colors that you're using, that'll help you figure out how close they are in value and whether or not they have good contrast, because you'll just be comparing them on the same scale or grayscale. There's a site called accessiblecolors.com, so you can make sure that you're doing it right. But also contrast is really important for people who are colorblind because they might not be able to see certain things on your site or differentiate between different things. And contrast and use of color is extremely important for accessibility in that way. And not just color blindness, there are other vision-related disabilities that might make it more difficult for them to navigate your site if you have low contrast or poor color design in general. Yeah. You can see the difference in this clip between the first and second versions of the colors here, in that they have different contrast levels. The first one has kind of all paler colors and they kind of all blend together in grayscale and normally. The second one, when they make the red and the blue darker, it's so much easier to see the shapes as they are. And they just call so much more attention to themselves. In terms of just stylistic preferences and things that are just not recommended, using pure black is one of those things. No one actually uses pure black because it's very hard on the eyes. So you can see that there's a comparison between these two mid-fidelity mock-ups, the pure black versus the dark gray. And you can tell already that the black is extremely harsh. So yeah, this is a hex code for an off black. That is recommended. Also, people don't use pure white as often either because that's also pretty hard on the eyes. So slightly off white as well. So maybe you've picked all of the colors that you want to use. You feel like you have the perfect color scheme. So how do you know where to put them? So there's this awesome article that I'm basically going to go through the gist of right now. And this designer has picked this like really nice blue, a really nice yellow, and a really nice red. And they want to use all of them. So they put them all in it like this. But you can already see that this is kind of a lot, and it's just not that pleasing to look at because everything is just so bright and they're all kind of competing for your attention. So here's how you actually would use it. Red ends up being part of the notification symbol, using what we learned before, it's used to denote important things. This designer also uses different values and tints of similar colors. So you can see, especially in these two sections, that there's a whole variety of hues and values within the same like color system for the yellow and for the gray, and kind of for the blue too, and this like greenish color. And that allows them to make everything feel very compatible and very uniform with each other without being overwhelming. And the use of neutrals really makes it a lot more easier on the eye. So then when you actually do use color, there's more attention called to those colors, and it creates hierarchy in a different way than the visual hierarchy that we talked about in the beginning of the class. Here, this teal color is also a notification symbol, and the contrast it has with starker blue is great, and it's also what your eye is drawn to if you're looking in the sidebar immediately, and that is already important for how you would use this knockoff Slack. If you want more details about what went through the process of this, I've linked the original article in the slide. So now we're going to go through a brief explanation of how I matched a color scheme through images, because this is something that's pretty difficult. Most websites are pretty image heavy because that's how people respond to content a lot of times, but it's super important for your images to have a cohesive color scheme as well, as I was kind of talking about during the Figma tutorial. But all of these images kind of match each other, and from those images you can draw a color scheme, or if you had one in mind, this is kind of how you'd match it. So as you can see, the main colors that were established in the beginning are kind of brown, yellow, in dark gray. So after selecting this image, I selected other images. So the blue is across or related to the yellow in the color wheel because it's not quite opposite, but it's another one of the complementary primary colors, sorry. And that's why they go very well together. In general, this like dark blue, dark yellow goes pretty well together. And I found ways to introduce this color into the images without making it the whole subject of the image. And they all have darker tones, which kind of complement each other, and you can find the same types of browns within the 3 pictures, as well as in the lower banner, you can see the grays pretty clearly. And just matching your color scheme and your images really helps make the whole site feel more carefully designed, detailed, and just cohesive as a whole, and breaks in the color scheme aren't distracting for the user. And I think that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Cool. If there are no questions left, you guys are free to go. Have a nice Tuesday. We'll see you guys on Thursday.